Byanjana Thapa is a writer trained as a biologist who has a habit of sitting on her work. She's still becoming. Apart from reading and writing, she is committed to deepening her yoga practice, which she just talked about, and knowledge about wines and helping run Sangini Bhed, an organization creating confidential and compassionate conversation spaces for Nepali-speaking, female identifying individuals. And she currently lives in New York. Byanjana has she's won many prizes, which I think we can talk about in the course of this conversation. And how many blogs have you had?
When I was younger, I had one called Accidentally Orange, which orange was my favorite color. And I was the third kid that was born like 13 and 11 years after my siblings. So I always thought of myself as that orange happy accident. So, but that was almost 10 years ago. And I think I kind of grew a little bit out of what I was writing then. And so I started this other one, which is kind of inspired by The Artist is Present, who's this sort of, I think she's from former Yugoslavia. She does these performance pieces, and I really liked that idea. So that's where The Writer is Present kind of comes from.
So I remember Accidentally Orange because the blogger was called Suntali, right? If I'm not mistaken. Suntali, that was the pseudonym, if I may call it that. And I just think I will sort of recap on the times that we were writing in, because when I look back, I feel like there was this time which was really vibrant for young women writers in Nepal who are using blogs as their personal writing space. And I think for many, it was a space to vent. I think for many, it was also a place to record their experiences, sometimes frustration, anger, right? Shame, all kinds of experiences. And you were one of the writers I was following at that time. But there was also this big group of other writers who I think I'll take a moment to mention at this point, and you can add to the list if they come to your mind. So I remember Yukta, definitely, Yukta Bhattacharya. There was Ayushma Ragni. There was, of course, Shraddha Thapa and Shreya Thapa. Nepali Kitty, right? And then there was Kanchan Burakati. There was Sanjana Shrestha. There was, who were some of the other writers? There was, of course, Pranay Rana and Darshan Karki, Shraddha Mukhia. Do you want to add to that list?
I actually, this one was probably, I think she kept it a little anonymous, but Jerusha, my friend, she had one called Jerusha Rice. Jerusha Rice, she's a pretty famous singer-songwriter now. Her work is really amazing, and I like hers as well. So, but I don't know if she still writes on that,
Okay, so I'm just wondering, like, because this was a space that was shared by so many women, and I think many women read each other, like it almost seemed like there was this group of women bloggers and they were reading each other, and I feel like there's possibly this influence. We're influencing each other also in our writing. So at this point, I'm wondering, because you said earlier on that this was one of the first blogs that you were, this was one of your first blogs, right? So what did it mean to you to be using this space? Who is Suntali? Who was?
I think I was always kind of shy. Actually, I think I still am with my writing. And I started that blog right after high school when I was working at the Kathmandu Post for some time. And I'd met a bunch of people who were very involved in the literary community in Kathmandu. The Word Warriors, for example, which I joined very briefly. And it was a great time, made great friends. And I think that really emboldened me, gave me a lot of confidence that I can put my stuff out there, even when, being a little bit of a perfectionist when it comes to my work. I think I felt strongly confident enough that I could put something out there that doesn't have to be perfect, that people can appreciate the spirit of it. And also there was a lot of back and forth then too. People were commenting on the poems, and even, there was criticism as well, which was great. You know, it was nice to see your work from a different perspective, but it really encouraged me to actually even put it out there, which was always something I kind of was not very brave about doing. And seeing all these other women doing it so fearlessly was also very, very inspiring. But I think the kinds of stuff I was writing back then was very angsty and personal, and a lot about like frustration with love and very like society and that kind of thing, which, you know, not to say that those aren't important or, you know, worthwhile topics to write about, but I think over the years I've been trying to express slightly different thoughts, I guess.
So we have a comment from Yukta here, and she says, I remember that blog. I remember both of your various blogs. Love you. Thank you for that.
Yeah.
So, and then you also worked at the Kathmandu Post for a while, right? And I remember we didn't really have a chance to have a conversation then, but I do remember you from the Kathmandu Post days, and you were this really young person who was running around doing stories of your own. How did that shape you as a writer? Because this was some of your first, I'm sure there were these firsthand experiences related to the people you were interviewing, people you were writing about, right? How did that influence? It's going to be a lot about influence today.
Yeah. So I think those I guess the last 3 years I was in Nepal, so high school and working at the Kathmandu Post, really kind of tightened my writing, because in high school I had a teacher, English teacher, Miss Berry, who she was ruthless and very usefully ruthless, because I tended to have very long and elaborate kind of writing, and she made sure that it was shorter, and she emphasized brevity, clarity of thought. So that definitely shaped me a lot and kind of prepared me going into the Kathmandu Post also, where, you know, when you have a tight deadline, and I was kind of doing more features articles, so I didn't have as pressing deadlines as, you know, like news people did. I was working under the iron fist of Amishra's movie.
Are you there in this conversation? Are you listening to that?
I don't know if he's here, but I remember my first assignment, and Niranjan Shrestha, Niranjan Dai was my photographer, accompanying photographer, and it was kind of just like, all right, go write about this, and you know, it was kind of just you just sink or swim almost, which was great for an 18-year-old to be working at a national newspaper and getting that kind of exposure. So I think working with deadlines is definitely something I've learned very quickly, had to learn very quickly on the job. Writing under time pressure, which currently does not really exist for me, which might also, you know, when you don't have a deadline, you kind of just take your sweet time and then dilly-dally. So I do appreciate having that. And I think that also gave me a lot of discipline as a writer. And again, the brevity thing that I do struggle with a bit. I think they're also knowing that, okay, this can be said in way fewer words is something I learned there as well.
I see that Dipti Sechan is also in this conversation, and just wanted to mention that she's also one of the people blogging at this time when, the time we mentioned earlier. A couple of questions on the screen here, but I'll keep them for later so that you can answer them a little later. Byanjana, what were some of the most what were some of your most important memories when you're growing up as a child in a household which, from what I understand, was a place where people were reading a lot, right?
Yeah. So my dad, he studied English literature in college and got a master's in English literature, which something he's very, very proud about, because he's from Dhankuta, and my parents are both from Dhankuta, and they moved later. And so kind of I grew up around a lot of people who were kind of like from Kathmandu, and as you can imagine, there's a lot of socioeconomic differences that happen there that I'm not going to go into necessarily, but that was such a point of pride for him to be this self-made person who was reading all these greats of literature. And so my sister, who's the oldest, she was also a lit fanatic. And so growing up, they were always quoting, talking about Shakespeare and all of this stuff. And I was 13 years younger than my sister. And so just, I think, you know, children are sponges. So I think I just kind of soaked all of that in. And, you know, since that was such an important part of our family, I think that just kind of naturally manifested in me as well. Also, I grew up in a couple of different countries because my father was a diplomat. He's retired now. And a lot of times I also found that changing countries and cultures so many times, it was hard to always relate to the people that I was going to school with. And reading and writing was kind of I wouldn't say escape, I don't like that word, but kind of solace to me, or an opportunity to sort of look inwards, which I was doing a lot. When you don't always relate to people around you, you kind of look inwards. And I would spend so much time, I remember, and that's when I really started writing, is around 10, 11, just as puberty was hitting, you know what I'm saying? So I was writing a lot. I was in my room a lot. And I think at times when my parents were saying, you should go out and play with people, I was mostly sitting in my room and doing that. And I had a very, very active imagination from a very young age. And I kind of just lived in that world a lot. And I think I became a little more gregarious as I grew older, but I think I was very much more introverted when I was younger. And I think that really planted the seed of the kind of introspection that I still do to this day, but at 10, you know?
I think it's in one of these interviews that Zadie Smith says that most writers are introverts, and that's why we write. But I'm not sure if it's true for everyone, but I think for maybe that's how you vent, or that's how you express yourself. So you lived in different countries, right? And then and I know you also speak many languages. So I find it very interesting that for writers, especially writers who speak so many languages and know so many languages, you still have the option of picking a language that you think is your language and the language that you want to write in, right? How do you feel about that as somebody who knows and speaks so many languages, the comfort of language that you write in?
Wow, that's an interesting question. So while I do speak quite a few languages, I definitely am not as fluent as I am in English and Nepali. So I think I also, because of how much English was spoken around the house, and growing up in New York when I was a kid, I think English just naturally became my language of preference. And also back in Nepal also, we went to an English medium school, so Nepali was just one subject. So I think that just kind of naturally happened. I don't think I've really consciously thought about that. But you know, knowing a couple of other languages and knowing that, and even Nepali, you know, the fact that there's so many emotions or concepts, especially when it comes to wisdom and proverbs that you can't translate, that I find, you know, being at the junction of all these different languages, that sometimes I find challenging to say, oh wow, there's this really lovely way of saying it in Spanish, but I can't say it in English, you know. So but you know, apart from that, I haven't really considered expressing in another language. I think there's just still so much deeper to go in English. So
Okay. I find, I don't know, I'm just so intrigued by language. The reason I asked you this question was because like for me, I've never felt like I have a language, you know, and although I do speak a couple of languages, I feel like I'm not good at any of these languages that I speak, and I'm not good enough to be a writer in any of these languages because I am not a fluent writer or speaker of any of these languages. Do you think that really, how do you think the knowledge of a language impacts how a person writes? Or do you think it's more about just the thought process and less about how well you're able to? of perfection of a language?
I think it's somewhere in the middle. I think there have been times I've tried to write in French and I just feel frustrated because I don't have the words. Um, and I also have talked to people who feel that way about writing in English, even though they speak in English consistently, and it's not as though they struggle with fluency. It's just sometimes I think it's about finding the right word, and even though you know what you want to say in your head, a lot of people I think struggle with putting that on paper. And I think that's more of a, rather than a fluency or skill issue, I think it's more an internal block, some kind of internal block, or lack of confidence. And I don't say this unkindly at all, but just being self-conscious and kind of almost putting that block on yourself before you even put anything on the page, which, all of us struggle with, and I've struggled with as well. But I think language is, learned over time, and there've been, Joseph Conrad, for example, who just learned all these languages and wrote in all these languages that he learned later in life. I think that the technicalities of that can always be improved. I think it's the confidence to actually express whatever it is, and maybe take feedback, or maybe learn from other writers. I think that's really how you can get over that mental block, I'd say.
Have you ever sought refuge in writing? Has that ever been something for you?
Yeah, absolutely. I think I do that constantly, which is why I write so much on my blog. All is still drafts, because they never get published on the blog. But if you hack into my blog, you probably know. I'm not trying to give anyone any ideas.
You don't want that happening now.
I think most of yeah, please, actually, please don't do that. I'm sure most of you have some, or not most, but some of you probably have the skills to do that, but don't. No, I think most of my writing is kind of for myself, and so it never really gets seen by anybody else, and that's the refuge that I have. That was also my relationship with poetry, was when there was this acute emotion that would come knocking, and it could come at any time. It could be 3 a.m, and especially in college, this was happening a lot. And I think because naturally I was, in college you have like an 8 a.m. class, then the next day you don't have a class till 3 p.m, so your sleep schedule is whack. So I always felt like I was led around by my emotions, and so I used poetry because a quick way to like get it out, and it would come fully formed. I use the word whelping because the imagery of the dog that comes out with the amniotic sac intact. But because I was seeking refuge in that, I felt that I didn't quite have the discipline that I wanted as a writer. And I think I was being sort of led by those emotions and like at the mercy of that, rather than being in control of my own writing, which is something that I think, as I've also over the years started to kind of cultivate peace and equanimity in my life, that was another reason why I started to kind of turn more towards prose, where I felt that I'm in control of what's going on, that I can write in clarity of mind. I don't have to be embroiled by emotion, anger, sadness, or elation, even, the extremes of emotion. So I think now when to come back to what you said about seeking refuge, I think the refuge I find now is in, the sort of equanimity I find in gathering my thoughts and writing about something that's larger than just my ego at this moment.
I sort of get lost in the train of thought sometimes when I'm trying to listen to what the other person's saying, but I'm trying to gather my thoughts and come back to where we started. Um, so you're somebody who is also interested in biology, and your profession is something that demands that you create a balance between scientific questioning and writing. Yeah. How do you do that?
Um, I think for a long time I struggled with finding that balance party in college. Um, and then afterwards, immediately afterwards, I worked in a research lab. So it was very, very technical stuff. And I thought, well, there's the scientist side of me that is purely rational. And then there's the writer who's emotional. And sometimes I felt like there was a tug of war between those two, even in personal relationships. You know, you want to be rational, but then you're emotional, or the other way around. And I felt that that was constantly in conflict, and those were kind of black and white parts of my identity. But over time, I started to, and I think this got precipitated a little when my grandmother passed away, late 2017. And at that time, I was reading a lot of philosophy that was a lot of existential philosophy, a lot of nihilism, good old nihilism, um, and Buddhist philosophy, which, you know, actually the Buddha says you shouldn't be intellectualizing these concepts, but realizing them in actuality. But of course, no one is there yet. So intellectually, this idea that, oh, the soul doesn't exist. And also I was working in a cancer research lab. So I'm looking at really the architecture of what an organism is, cells, protein cascades, you know. So I think when my grandmother passed away, there was a part of me that was saying, well, you shouldn't, she, you know, kind of almost heartlessly, well, she's just an organism that expired. This sounds so ruthless, but it was just a thought, you know. But then I realized I can't do that. I just cannot, because there's, no matter how much you want to say, okay, well, you know, it doesn't matter, there's no soul, there's no. The truth is, the human experience we have every day is all subjective, and we love the people we love. There's often no rationale behind that. And I think that really struggling with those two perspectives almost brought together this realization that I can find a way for both of those to coexist and not betray either of those identities. And so that's also around that time also I started to realize I can write fiction, I can write literature that also touches upon scientific stuff. So I think then I started to write some stuff that touched on the things I was interested in that were seemingly disparate: philosophy, science. Even the essay to Iba, Soul and Body kind of is both, you know, like the perspective of a or not objective thinker and a subjective feeler almost. So I think now I'm trying to find the interstices of those two realities or ways of thinking. And I read this book called Reality is Not What It Seems, which is about quantum gravity. And this physicist, Carlo Rovelli, says that, you know, good poetry and science, there's always been commonality between them because they're both trying to describe the same thing. And they both have the perspective that that thing is beautiful. So to keep those separate is actually wrong. Those things they really have the same intention at the end of the day. And I really like that quote. And I said, well, if the physicist can do it, I can find a way to do it too.
Right. And you've documented some of these thoughts in a story that was published on Lalit, which is dedicated to your Abba, right? Um, do you want to tell us more about some of your stories that were published here? And you also won a prize for one of your stories. Byanjana has actually won a lot of prizes, right? She also taught
Not that
numerous
many.
classes. Tell us about these
um,
that you won the prizes for. You
Sorry?
won you won a prize for a story that was published on Lalit.
Yeah.
Should-
Right. Yeah. To drown. Yeah. So that one was about a young girl who's sort of, there's a couple of things going on there. Firstly, her parents have died and she lives with her grandmother, who is very bitter because her son died, because her son married out of the caste. So there's that, so there's but she's from a rich family. She lives in relative comfort, but she's very isolated because, first of all, she's a shy person. Second of all, she's hitting puberty just right, and she struggles with so many different things and doesn't really know how to express it. And on top, she has a crush on somebody in the neighborhood who is from a lower socioeconomic class. And so that's a no-no. And so it's basically her just kind of trying to navigate all these things. And at the same time come to terms with what's happened and how her parents passed away. So yeah, I don't know. That's all I'm going to say. You guys should read the story.
Yes, you guys should read the story. You should be able to Google it and find the story. So just look for Byanjana and Lalit, and the stories there. And which sort of moves me to this other question, because now I'm thinking of what Praveen said about your writing. I find your writing very lyrical, Byanjana. And you mentioned that Praveen Adhikari, the writer, had something to say about how you write, right? Do you want to tell us what his
Yeah,
um,
yeah.
observation
So,
about your
so
writing
that
was?
was back. Sorry.
No, no, go on, go on.
Oh, yeah. So I met Praveen Dai when I was working a little bit with the Word Warriors, the slam poetry group, and very soon I realized I was not designed to be a slam poet. That my poetry was kind of more written form than spoken word. But I met him then, and I, of course, was showing a lot of my work to him. And even over the years, when I moved here, I would still send him some of my stuff. And I trust his perspective a lot. And so back then, he would say to me that I wrote beautiful sentences, but that I should consider writing prose rather than poems. And I remember I thought I was a poet then. That was my identity, was I'm a poet. And so I remember being like, how could you say that, and taking offense.
Question your
But
identity as a poet.
yeah, like, how dare you? No, I'm kidding. But often you get advice that's good for you and you just don't want it or you're not ready to hear it or whatever. So, but over the years, I realized he was right. And he had even said, well, I had the same journey. I started out thinking I was a poet, but I realized that it's not really my form. And as I started to kind of incorporate the same stuff that I was lyrical, as you said, I guess, like that kind of style or vibe, I don't know if there's a better word for that, and kind of carrying it over to writing prose, I realized that I didn't have to stick so much with, like, sort of the elements that go into poetry: structure, rhyme. And not that you have to rhyme necessarily, but I felt liberated from those sort of constraints. And then when I was writing prose, I felt that I could use the best of the style of poetry, and then kind of it relaxed me more, I think, translating that over. And then I didn't have to keep this theme consistent. I could add dialogue in, like there was a lot of stuff that I could do that I wasn't able to do in poetry. And so I think I found now finally a happy medium. So thanks, Praveen, for bursting my bubble all those years ago.
I hope he's watching, and if he isn't, I think we can always send him a link later when it's posted on YouTube. Yeah. So you also write a lot of flash, right? And we talked about this earlier, but usually people say that it's one of the forms of writing which is like a flash in the pan, and people don't really take flash so seriously because I've heard a lot of writers say that there is very little impact of flash. But what does it mean to you to write flash? Because I know you're somebody who enjoys this form a lot.
Yeah. So I think flash enables, again, my sort of laziness and maybe lack of discipline when it comes to longer forms of writing, which is something I'm really working on because I want to eventually write a novel. So like I really have to work on that discipline. But I think what I love so much about Flash is I find it to be a complete work in its own. And even though it might be short, and maybe again, this is a medium between being able to just express a thought, and it's like a one thought or one theme or one, and not have it to be like a poem and stick to that sort of structure or anything. I think it's almost like a journal for me. For when I write flash, I see it almost like a short, quick, and devastating journal entry. I think you can really hit very hard with flash, and the investment that the reader has to make is not so much either, but the reader hopefully walks away with is actually so heavy. And this isn't exactly flash, but I think what really gave me encouragement to pursue that, because I always, again, thought like, oh, well, didn't take that form so seriously, but I was reading this book called Bluets or Bluets, I don't know. I think her name is Maggie Nelson. I do have that book here, but she had random thoughts, and they seemed like they couldn't, I was like, how could this kind of writing have a home? But the fact that she did it, and yes, I mean, it's a little different because there's one whole theme and stuff, but if you look at each individual piece too, each piece can stand on its own and have its merit, as a serious piece of writing. So that's when I kind of started writing flash. And I find that it's quite a liberating form of writing. And a lot of the thoughts that are expressed there can really be enjoyed and influential, I think, to people reading it.
So I'm just wondering, like, can we put it this way? So Flash is, they're standalone pieces which are also part of a whole, a bigger whole for you, right? So you've also been working on your novels, you said. How's that going? Tell us about the process.
You can see behind, that's all the planning over there on the wall. I talked earlier about the block, the self-imposed block. I think I know everything that I want to say and separate ideas. And they're, again, kind of like science fiction, philosophy sort of hybrids. I'm very bad with genres, by the way. I don't think I could really say I'm this writer. But I've been spending a lot of time in character development and ideas and planning chapters and stuff, but like actually writing out the manuscript has really appreciated if there was a deadline hanging over me, but I think at this point it has to be self-discipline and a self-deadline. So all I can say is that it's inching along.
Ask you my next question. So from whatever I have read of your writing, I know that some of your writing is also very inward looking, and you're also trying to it almost seems to me like you're trying to understand yourself through whatever you're writing, right? So is your writing, do you think your writing is also a form of self-discovery for you?
Yes, yeah, absolutely. And I think a lot of the flash pieces are actually, I would say all of my flash pieces are about me, about a discovery of, or kind of mm, making sense of the world around me or an experience I'm having, and kind of like describing the journey between perception of what's going on and and the consciousness and the experience that I'm having of it. So it's kind of whatever's in between. And again, maybe this is coming from the scientist who perceives and tries and objectively, but then by the time it comes in, it's already subjective. So yeah, I think it's a lot of philosophizing. Also, I think, and especially in the flash pieces I write.
Um, what do you think of the importance of workshopping for writers?
Workshopping? Oh man, I don't think I've been in a writing workshop in a decade. um,
But how do you think they help writers, or
I
what?
think definitely with confidence, for sure. I think I forgot who said this, but it really stuck with me. To create is to have the capacity to be embarrassed, and I think a lot of us don't have that. And a lot of the writers that I really admire, Yukta and Ujjola, for example, their level of bravery is just through the roof. And I think workshopping or having retreats, let's say, or wherever you can share your writing, there's a sense of trust there that you're not going to be judged, and I think that's very good for confidence and building kind of that bravery to put your stuff out there. um, Personally, I have not really done a lot of workshops, I think because I'm so shy with what I write that unless, and this is something I need to get over, but unless I feel like it's worth somebody else reading, I wouldn't really venture out with that. Whereas I think in workshops, it's raw and that's fine, and that's allowed. So I think it's a great opportunity for, and especially as you earlier mentioned, people who might feel that there's all this stuff they want to express or they feel like they don't have the language or the tools. I think that creates a sense of community and again trust, where you can just let go of that expectation. Like it doesn't have to be anything devastating or like Nobel Prize winning. It's just that freedom that it affords, I think is very useful for writers, for sure.
Hmm. Byanjana, who are your readers? Who do you think is your target group, like target audience?
Oh, that's a good question too. I think people who care about what happens to this world, I would say. That's so vague. Um,
No, I think there's a lot of depth in what you just said. Yeah,
oh.
poetic. Do you want to read something out for our readers?
Sure. Yeah. So since we talked so much about the flash pieces, maybe I'll read something that I wrote in. So I was living in Boston for a few years, and so there's this place called Provincetown off of Cape Cod, and I went there, it's actually a summer town, but I went there in the winter. Mary Oliver, who's one of my favorite poets, who passed away recently, she lived there for so many years, so I kind of did like a little pilgrimage. So I wrote this piece when I was there, and it's called Provincetown in the Winter. Standing on the main shore, I see Long Point, a scant band on the horizon. On a map, it is a sweeping scythe, cupping a portion of ocean that is now rattling in the wind. With my 2 feet on firm land, I wonder how hundreds of years ago the children of men digested such frothing vastness as they made their way across the Atlantic. Behind me, Provincetown is a ghost town. It is dead in the winter, but in the summer it flourishes, becoming a repository, a bustling union of commerce and the arts. I imagine the people flooding in during summer as flesh blooming over the skeleton of the town, a reverse time lapse of bodily decay. Now, in the dead of winter, in every direction, the light is otherworldly, as are the dunes of sand softly grading into ocean, and the tufts of ragged vegetation scattered like acne. Something Martian about it all. The surrealism creeps into my marrow as easily as does the wind, which is siphoning off the polar chill of the ocean. One is at once in awe of and terrified by the open and endless beauty of it all. Somewhere inside me, I finally locate my being. It is tugging for the familiarity of my city home. Streets flooded in comforting electric light, open businesses, the presence of humankind. I do not blame it. Like all things, it simply fears for its safety, appeals to its own continuity. For out here, my existence is easily meaningless. I am a single soundbite in the universal hum, and no one is listening. I could drop into the ocean and become engulfed by its eternity. The proportions are terrifying. So that's Provincetown in the winter. There's a second part to that, but I guess you guys can read it later. It's not yet. It's on my blog though. Sorry?
Maybe as a part of your novel?
I don't know. I feel like these guys are good. Like they're complete on their own. I don't want them anymore.
I get it. So, Byanjana, I think we'll have to close on that note. I'm going to take a moment to thank you on behalf of the team. And I think this has been a really nice first one-on-one conversation for me with you, because although I've always felt that you're such an amazing person over the years, I never really had a chance to have a conversation with you. And I think Shefali joins me in her sentiments when I say this.
Oh, thank you. And I feel the same way about you and about her.
So yeah, so enjoy the rest of your Sunday, and thank you.
Thank you. Thanks for having me, and thanks everybody who tuned in, and thank you for all of your lovely questions.
Yeah. So I also want to thank Vishal and Shefali for holding this up and for posting all the questions there, and also want to thank all of you who are, I think many of you who are Byanjana's friends who also joined this conversation. And yeah, thank you so much.
Thank you.